Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Three Principles Global Community webinar. The Three Principles Global Community, also known as 3PGC, is a nonprofit organization that's committed to bringing an understanding of the three principles to people throughout the world. Today, we have Angus Ross with us, and Angus was a fashion and advertising photographer for nearly 30 years. And he has, after 30 years, Angus completed his mentorship with Pransky and Associates and turned his attention to coaching. From the defense industry to women's retail, from the prison system to the world of sport, from couples and individuals to large groups, Angus has seen firsthand how this understanding is relevant to all sectors and loves the diversity he finds in his flourishing practice. Angus's website is angusrossconsulting.com, and I'll post that under the recording on YouTube as well, in case you want to get in touch with him. So, Angus, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Bonnie. And my goodness, 30 years of fashion photographer, I feel really old now. So when I was invited to do this webinar, and I was thinking about the path that I would take, it seemed glaringly obvious to me that I would really try and focus on the insights that I've accumulated over the last, I guess, three or 4 years that I've been doing it. Because one thing that really pinged out for me when I was first introduced to this understanding is that people really seem to teach the principles through stories about, you know, their insights, through their defining moments. And so that's the direction I wanted to go today. I guess it's going to be kind of be like my greatest hits album over the last 3 years. And in actual fact, it's quite funny because I had a little insight just before I came onto this webinar. And I realized that, you know, I was feeling a little bit nervous this morning because I haven't done one of these before. And so my nerves were up. And then I have this strange pattern that comes into being whenever I get nervous, is I get really tired. And I've, you know, this is nothing new. This has been happening for years. And I remember going on dates when I was, you know, in my early 20s. And I'd have an appointment to see some girl or a rendezvous point with some girl, and then I would get extraordinarily nervous. I would feel like I want to fall asleep, and so I would have a lot of judgment about that. It's like, well, I can't show up. How am I going to show up and be this, you know, this tired? I'm going to really let myself down. And I felt this morning, and that thinking tried to get on board that experience. And then I realized, no, this is interesting. This is the intelligence behind life. This is my wisdom telling me to settle down. And so what would normally be the pattern would be I'd start pacing up and down the room or try and keep very active. I actually decided to listen to my wisdom, and I just sat down and just chilled for, you know, a good 15 minutes and really settled down. So that for me was like quite an aha moment, because I definitely have fallen foul of that thinking. You know, that thinking has been invisible to me for a long time. So I will approach life anew on that level. I will sit down and chill next time I feel my nerves prop up, if I can. But so anyway, so I thought I would start at the very beginning. And the very beginning for me with the principles was when my good wife, Rohini, was disappearing up to the Pacific Northwest periodically for about a good 6 months, I want to say. And this was about 3 or 4 years ago. What was it? Well, anyway, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago. You don't have to answer. We'll say 3 or 4 years ago. And at this point in time, my wife was, you know, she was a very accomplished therapist. And I knew that within, under the auspices of her practice, she would be encouraged to go and add more strings to her bow. So she was often doing, you know, doing more trainings, as it were, going off and doing trainings. And I assumed that this was just another one of those trainings that she was kind of like, I wouldn't say she was mandated to do, but she, of her own volition, just wanted to sort of get more know-how, as it were. So I guess for me, at this point, I think I was only grateful that I wasn't being dragged along. because I think that Rahini, and forgive me for saying this, but with all due respect, I think you were a bit of a personal growth junkie for a good few years. And I would get dragged along kicking and screaming to a lot of these seminars, usually probably in the form of some ultimatum because I'd been absolutely dreadful to you and that this was going to save our marriage. So anyway, so you would disappear up to the Pacific Northwest, and I didn't really know what you were doing. I didn't know about the Pranskys. I didn't know about the principles back then. And I kind of just let you get on with it. And as I say, I was just kind of grateful that I wasn't being sucked into it. But then this really interesting thing happened, was that you would go up there, and I think it may have been the first time that you went up there, maybe the second time, I don't know. And you've been back a couple of days, and I don't know what had happened, but we got into it wasn't like we got into an altercation, there was a disagreement. And I was in a really low mood and behaving pretty badly. Sorry, I've got a frog in my throat. I need to drink something. And I said a few mean things, and actually said something which I actually in that moment in time thought was really pretty over the top. And I was just waiting for your reaction. And normally, if I had said anything along those lines, we'd have locked horns and there would have been a huge fight. But there was just no response. And I actually remember saying, I was like, well, have you got no response to that? That's not impacting you in any way. Because I thought I'd said something quite heinous. And she just looked at me, and she had this look of incredible compassion in her eyes and said, I can just see that you're suffering with your thinking. And I'm like, suffering with my thinking? That's new. I mean, I guess under normal circumstances, I'd always imagined that she'd come back with some sort of clever sort of psychobabble in the past that wouldn't feel particularly authentic. But in this particular moment, it just felt so authentic and just so aligned with the truth, what she was saying. Added to which this look of compassion on her face just really held up this mirror to me and made me feel like a total arsehole. I just could really see how badly I was behaving by the virtue of the fact that she was actually in this place that just felt like, it just seemed so authentic and real. And she felt this compassion that was just really, to me, kind of mind-blowing in the moment. And it really took the wind out of my sails. Anyway, so there were probably one or two more moments where maybe I had behaved badly. And Rahini would just have this look of love and compassion in her eyes. And I'm like, she thinks I'm suffering with my thinking again. That's what's happening here. And so it kind of piqued my interest. And she had already alluded to the fact that as a mentee with the Pranskys, that there was this opportunity to bring someone with her. And as I heard it, it was to bring a client. She will say that was not the case, that she was just bringing me up there just to sort of meet the Pranskys and get introduced to this understandings. But I always imagined that I was going up there as a client, and that always kind of felt really weird to me. But I was curious about what was going on up there. So eventually I agreed, I'll come up there, but I'm not going up as your client. I don't feel comfortable about that. But so anyway, so we get up to Lacona, where the Pranskys are situated. And on this particular weekend, it's George Pransky. Rahini's working with George, and I knew nothing about the principles. I knew nothing about what was going to happen. I just assumed it was just like therapy. So it felt really weird to think that my wife would be sitting in the room on my therapy session. So I was adamant she wasn't going to be there. And then when the session started and George walked in, I explained that, what was going on. He said, well, I really encourage you to have Rahini here. You'll be doing yourself a total disservice if you continue in this vein. I really strongly suggest that you have her come in and be a party to this. So anyway, George, being the compelling person that he is, persuaded me that was the thing to do. And we did our intensive together. So what happened was that for me, those 3 days, George was talking about, how our thinking creates our suffering, that there's this tendency to blame the outside world for how we're feeling inside. And that's actually, we want to flip that round. That's not the case. That's really a different direction we're going to be pointing in as far as this understanding is concerned. We want you know, to take dominion over your feelings and not blame outside circumstances. And then he was talking about the intelligence behind life, and that when our thinking settles down, that's much more accessible to us. And he was saying that this was really a way to show how the mind works. So he was coming up with all this very, to me it was just very simplistic information. And what was kind of so funny is that I was still thinking I was in this sort of therapeutic environment. I was having sort of, you know, maybe some sort of form of therapy. And what was really interesting is every now and again, I was expecting these sessions to last for about 2 hours, but on a couple of occasions, after literally 30 minutes, George just got up and walked out. And I would turn to Rahini, I was like, what's going on? Why is he leaving? And Rahini says, because I think he thinks you've seen something. And I've said, I've seen something. I said, what's there to see? This is just common sense to me. So anyway, this is what sort of went on for 3.5 days. And by the end of it, I felt like we'd had, I definitely had settled down and we'd had some really interesting conversations. But it was just basic common sense to me. The principles for me were just like, well, yeah, that's interesting, but really that's not really earth-shattering information. But then we went back home. We came back to LA, and we were getting on like a house on fire. Our relationship was just in this really great place. And after about a week, I said to myself, wow, I can't believe this. What happened in La Conra? There's just no real accounting for how well we're doing. And talk about well-being. Our relationship was definitely in a place of well-being. And it was kind of as if in that moment I tempted fate. And then we got into this huge fight. And it started in the morning one day. And then it carried on into the afternoon, carried on into the evening. We even went to sleep hating each other, I want to say. I can't speak for Rahini, but my feelings were pretty distraught at that point. And then I remember waking up the following morning, and I was in exactly the same place. And I tested the water with her, and it seemed like the same thing was going on for her. So I walked out of the bedroom, went into the kitchen, and I was getting ready to go to work. And I was about to leave, and I thought, oh no, I'm going to have the last word, because I'm a bit of a last word freak. I'm going to have my say. I'm going to walk into that bedroom and I'm going to give it to her both barrels. And so I remember walking into the bedroom, and the words that started to come out of my mouth were something along the lines of like, oh, look at us. Here we are. We've invested all this money in more psychological snake oil, and we're in exactly the same place. Look at us. Look at it. It's all bullshit. Here we are again, fighting like cats and dogs. And these were the words that were coming out of my mouth. But what was really interesting in this very moment, in the eye of that storm, I just suddenly had this realization that I hadn't got a clue how this argument started. I had no idea why we were fighting. And it kind of derailed me. So it was like these words were coming out of my mouth, but in my head, I'm going through this sort of like experience of like, what it was almost like, and it's so difficult for me to articulate, and I hope I do a good job today, but it was kind of like, I suddenly saw my thinking in that very moment. It was kind of like, the only way I can describe it is that, those stereograms where you look at a picture and you look at it one way and you see these geometric shapes, and then you look at it another way and there are dolphins leaping out of the ocean. I don't know if you know those stereograms. But that was kind of like what happened. In that very moment, I suddenly saw my thinking. And I could see the principles in action. It was just like everything that I'd heard from George in those 3 days just suddenly came. And I think that what had happened is I came away with this intellectual understanding, but in that very moment, I had an experiential understanding. And it was kind of like I hopped from one side of the fence to the other, and I kind of got to see my thinking from the vantage point of my essential nature, my innate essential nature, that was really seeing how how I was really very much the architect of my own suffering. The fact that I couldn't remember just really seemed to demonstrate the illusory nature of my thinking. And I just realized that, you know, I really love my wife, and I don't want to be having a fight. I don't want to be in this space. And so I literally, as these words were coming out of my mouth, I started crying, which was just so bizarre in itself. And then before I'd even finished my sentence, I started crying, which quickly segued into laughter. So she must have thought I'd gone stark raving mad. But I guess what happened is that moment is I just had this supreme moment of clarity where it just everything slotted into place. And I could see how this is what I do. This is the dance that, you know, that I indulge in, that when I believe in my thinking, particularly in the context of our relationship. And just the relief to be able to let that go, just to see that we're actually, our relationship is perfect as it is, that it is in a state of perfect mental health, and that it really, the only thing that gets in the way is this crazy thinking that we would maybe both have from time to time. So that would probably be, I'd have to say, my greatest insight to date. That would be probably the most important insight in terms of that really got me on the three principles train. But so that was wonderful. And I think that this went down in November, I want to say. And then I was curious about the principles, but it wasn't like I was like in a hurry to sort of, you know, learn a great deal more about them. You know, I was happy that I'd had this insight. But then in February, they have the professional training up in Lacona. And so Rahini suggested that I come up to that. And I was happy to go back to Lacona. I was happy to have a weekend with my wife, away from the kids maybe for a couple of days, kick back, go to some nice restaurants. So I went to this professional training, and it was, you know, it was what was so interesting about that is like having been to a lot of personal growth workshops, dragged kicking and screaming maybe, I would often find myself getting bored. You know, it takes a lot to hold my attention, I guess, in that realm. That was my judgment at that time. And then by the end of these few days, I just suddenly realized, wow, that was thoroughly entertaining from start to finish. I really enjoyed that. And it was the first time I'd ever been to a workshop where I just felt like I was fully engrossed, fully engaged, and it held my attention from start to finish. And the focal point at that particular training was grounding. So George and Linda and Bob were sharing about the importance of grounding and how you, if you're going to teach the principles, really just teach from a place of what you know. Don't go beyond your grounding. So I thought, well, that's interesting information, probably very useful if you're a coach, but I have no ambitions in that department whatsoever. I have no interest in becoming a coach. I know a lot of coaches, I know a lot of therapists, never had any inclination to enter into that field. And so the weekend finished, you know, I felt like I was in a very good place. Our relationship was a very good place. And then I think it was a couple of weeks later, and Rahini gets this email from the Pranskys inviting her to go to Oslo for a training in Oslo. And it was going to take place, I think, just literally over the course of one weekend. And so Rahini got this invitation as a mentee to join a bunch of other mentees to go out to Oslo to participate in this training. And then Rahini said, and you've been invited too. And I'm like, I have? They're inviting me too? My goodness, these people are so generous. Like, I can just come along and have a vacation for the weekend in Oslo. And she said, yeah, they want you to come. I said, wow, that's amazing. So anyway, so we packed our bags, went off to Oslo, and it was kind of crazy to go halfway across the world just for like a couple of days. And we arrived on the Friday night, pretty jet lagged, I might say. And the way that the weekend had been organized was that George was going to do a business training with a wonderful Erik Olsen, and then Linda was going to do a more personalized, you know, sort of like, I guess, a more sort of basic introduction to the 3 Ps, I want to say. And she was going to take a contingent of the mentees off to do that too. So I ended up in this contingent of mentees, and it was so funny because I think there there were 6 mentees, and Linda paired everybody up and said that I want you to run small groups. I'll be the main facilitator in the main room, and I want you guys to run small groups. So that seemed all worked out very well. And then she turns to me and she said, I don't know what to do with you, Angus. And in my mind, it's like, well, you don't have to do anything with me. But she says, I think I'm going to get you run your own small group. And in my head, I was like, are you crazy? I'm going to run my own small group? That's nuts. And it was so funny because I think in my head, my intellect was saying, no, there's no way I'm going to do that. And I think I was already trying to formulate an excuse as to why that was a horrible idea. And then it's so funny because I used to work with this guy who, whenever he would encounter a challenge or be given a challenging situation to deal with, he would rub his hands together and say, oh, that's so exciting. And I used to always think he's a total idiot because I used to think, oh my God, you're just like really throwing us under the bus because this is not exciting. This is horrible. This is going to be a real challenge to have to deal with this situation. But he'd always have this mantra. And it was like, I didn't even know the words came out of my mouth in response to Linda. I said, oh, that's so exciting. And so I ended up being leading my own small group. And so I guess as much as I moaned about being dragged to all those personal growth workshops, I think I had maybe some appropriate language to use, and maybe for all the therapy that I've been through, maybe I gave a good account of myself, and my small group went pretty well, and it was kind of hysterical because I think 2 people in my group, when we went back into the main room, had put their hands up to share and had said things about me that were quite flattering and put me in quite a good light. And there was one person in particular who said that I had been great. And so from that moment on, I was constantly being teased by Linda Pransky, and I would be referred to as the Great Angus. And this was kind of like became this standing joke this whole weekend. Anyway, moving swiftly on, we came to the end of that weekend, and George and Linda took Rahini and I to one side and strongly suggested that I would be a great candidate to become a mentee. And it was still, that kind of took me by surprise a little bit, but I let that marinate in my mind. And by the time that weekend finished, what I really noticed about the principles and about how people were teaching the principles, and Linda had been putting a lot of focus on the idea that people learn the principles by teaching them. What I could really see is that people were teaching the principles by sharing their stories. It was just basically storytelling. That's how I could see how this weekend had unfolded. This is a weekend of storytelling, people talking about their insights. And I thought to myself, you know what? I think I can do that. I like storytelling. And if that's what it boils down to, I think maybe I can do this. Maybe I should do this mentorship program. And God knows I wasn't enjoying the job that I was doing at the time. And if there was any way out of that, that was just a beautiful light at a pretty dark, long tunnel as far as I was concerned. So I thought, yeah, I'll do this mentorship program. So I signed up for the mentorship, and I started going up to Pacific Northwest. But no sooner had I signed up, and then my good wife decided, right, we got to get going. We got to start doing trainings. We got to start like getting this ball rolling. And I'm in my head like, well, like, hang on a minute. 1 minute, I'm a photographer, and the next minute I'm a coach. Give me some room to breathe here. So and it was a great experience, but I remember we did our first training, and I was still pretty wet behind the ears at that point. But I remember my ego really getting invested in the idea that I've got to really perform well. I've got to show up to this training and do a good job. So I remember really prepping and planning and rehearsing and writing. And I did this for probably, I don't know, I want to say a week or so. And so what happened was, the training, we did the training and it actually went really well. But the one thing was that I just felt horrible for the 7 days leading up to it. Packed with nerves. I was just so caught up in having to perform well that I just really didn't enjoy the experience. And so it actually it actually made me think twice. Well, maybe I don't want to be a coach. I don't know if I like this. I don't know if I want to have to go through this experience every time we do a training. That's going to really put me off. So anyway, so that went down, and then I think probably about a month or so later, we had another training to do. Rahini got me involved in another training, only this time it was in London. And so I thought, well, that's exciting. I'd love to do that. I'd love to go to London, see my family, et cetera, et cetera. But I was worried about having this experience of being racked with nerves. So I thought, oh my God, you know what? If I'm going to do this, if I'm going to do this London training, I'm not even going to prep for it. I'm just going to show up and talk from my grounding, whatever that is, and see what happens. And so I was determined to not do any prep. And you know, that's how I approached it. And we did the training, and in actual fact, it was a tremendous success. And it was a real eye opener to me that I could actually, you know, that little old me could show up and talk from what I felt, what little I know, and make some kind of impact, have some kind of value. So that was a real eye opener to me, and a fantastic experience. And then, you know, then we continued on, and then if we have time, I have a little aside here, because I had this other great insight while I was in London, which I think has really impacted me, and I use it as a training tool to talk about the principle of mind quite a lot these days. But after the training, I got some time to spend some time with my brother, who lives in this wonderful house in the country in Sussex. And I was sitting on the patio with him one day in the garden, and sipping G&T, I think, very English experience. And I remember my nephew had just bought himself a GoPro, and he was testing it out in my brother's ornamental pond, which he had proudly built some years before. And so he was showing us the results of his GoPro, and there were all these little fish in the pond. And I'm like, what are those fish? And my brother says, well, I have a really interesting story about those fish. And I'm like, well, do tell. And so he said, well, it's you know, you know that I belong to this fishing club, and I go there periodically through the year. Anyway, a few years back, I went to go fishing, and the lake had been drained. So, you know, much to my dismay, I went up to the grounds. Is it a ground gamekeeper, fish keeper? I don't know what the appropriate term would be. I want to say gamekeeper. He went up to the gamekeeper and says, what's going on? There's no water in the lake. What's happening? And he says, oh, well, we have to drain the lake every few years or so to get rid of the competing species. And in this respect, the competing species is a fish called a rudd. And we have to get rid of that fish. It's because it starts to compete with the trout, and our trout start to dwindle. So my brother, who always had felt very forlorn about the fact that he had no fish in his glorious ornamental pond that he'd built, said to the gamekeeper, I said, well, can I have some of those fish? You're just going to throw them away, are you? He said, yeah, they'll get turned into fertilizer or something. I said, well, let me take some of those fish. I'll take 20 of them. So he took 20 of these fish and put them in his ornamental pond. And they flourished, I think, for about a year and a half, until one day a heron turned up and literally wiped out the whole stock. They were gone in one fell swoop, literally. And so, so some years later, here I am sitting in this garden and looking at this GoPro of these little fish. And so my brother said, so what happened was, you know, the heron came and took away all the fully formed grown-up rudd. But after about a year, I suddenly noticed that there were all these little fish in the pond. The pond was filled with fish. In fact, they were baby rudd. And so through the course of about 3 years, I had observed these baby rudd, and they just didn't change size. They just remained they were like 2 inches long, as opposed to the 4 or 5 inches long a fully grown rudd is. And so what had happened is they had actually adapted to their environment. They had actually, something within their makeup had allowed them to sort of conform to their natural environment and not grow, so that they would overwhelm the niche, as it were. So I said to him, that's amazing, that's incredible.
don't you see? That's the intelligence behind life working through that species. And it's the same intelligence that we all have access to, where it's the same intelligence that's working through those fish, looking towards balance and harmony and well-being. And we have access to the same stuff. And my brother, I think, looked at me and thought, like, well, what have you been smoking? But I was just so excited by that, because it just really, for me, just really spelled out how, how mind works and operates. That it's really, that's we've all got that going on. Whatever life form we are, that's happening for us all. And whether we like it or not, that's in our corner. That's got our back. So for me, that was a big moment. So anyway, getting back to like as in my world of coaching, I think that I think by this point I probably had a couple more weekends to do in my mentorship program, and I think I actually got to the end of my mentorship program. And there are some stories to tell there, but I think that I want to, we've got a limited amount of time, so I want to jump forward to a point where, having completed my mentorship, Bob Patterson rings me up one day and says, so Angus, so we got this 3PGC conference coming up in LA in about, I think it was about 8 months time, 6 to 8 months time. And we want you and Rohini to MC it. And I'm sorry, but let me get rid of that. I want you and Rohini to MC it. And I'm in my head, it was kind of like my experience in Oslo. I was like, are you crazy? You can't be serious. And again, I think I may have even actually probably formulated an excuse. I can't remember if I did or I didn't, but I wasn't welcoming that information with open arms. And I actually seem to remember calling back after speaking to Rohini, where I got to soon realize that this was an amazing honor, an incredible opportunity. I'd be crazy to turn it down. I think, if memory serves me correct, I think you put me back on the straight and narrow. And so, so I rang Bob back and said, yeah, that would be fantastic. I'd love to do it. Yes, awesome. And so at least I thought at that point, well, at least I've got a good 6 months or so to worry about this. I don't really have to think about it now. And I had done nothing on that level before. I've done very minimal public speaking, but nothing to that scale in front of hundreds of people. So, so that, I thought, well, I'll shelve that for a while. I won't worry about that yet, but I'll just, feel good about the fact that they've even asked us to do it. And then, so what happened was that through the course of that next 6 months, in fact, pretty quickly, soon after being invited to do that, people asked me what I was doing, and I would say, oh, well, I'm going to be emceeing this conference with Rohini. And people would turn to me and say, oh, you'll be funny. And I'm like, I'll be funny? I'm not going to be funny. Do people expect me to be funny? I don't want to be funny. I can't go up there and be funny. I'm just going to I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm not going to be funny. But then more and more people kept saying that. And I was like, oh no, I'm going to have to really work at this. I'm going to have to really prep for this. And so, which was really kind of diametrically opposed to all the training that I'd had, particularly with the Pranskys. Because I remember George on my very first weekend working with a businessman. And the businessman was really suffering with nerves during his presentations and saying, well, the best way to let go of those is to be spontaneous in the moment and to not go to any kind of script. Don't really, don't think you can rely on your intellect to push you through that. You just got to really talk from your heart. And so I had this. The stakes were way too high for me at this point. I think I have to, I can't go into this situation when everybody is expecting me to funny. I'm going to have to write material. I'm going to have to prep like hell for this. I'm going to have to rehearse. And I have some friends who've done comedic training, have done stand-up comedy training, and they're all about rehearsal, about rehearse and rehearse until you get it absolutely perfect, bang on perfect, and then you're good to go. But that's not what I was hearing from George. Talk from your heart, be spontaneous. And I'm like, nope, I'm not doing that. I'm not going to risk going out on that stage and looking like a total fool, Because my big fear, and I think that's a lot of people's fear with public speaking, is that you're going to have this moment where you're going to forget what you're going to say. And you're going to want to have the stage swallow you up. And that was my thinking. So I started prepping, and probably about, I don't know, I want to say a month out, I was really going at it. I was really working at it, writing material, writing funny lines, etc., etc. And then I would start rehearsing. I'd start rehearsing in front of the mirror. I'd start rehearsing. I would start rehearsing in the car. And then I found myself in this situation about a week out before the event, that I was actually starting to have sleepless nights, because what was happening is I had this script, if you like, so ingrained in my thinking that I would rehearse constantly, and I would rehearse as soon as I got under the covers. And then I would always get to this point where I forget what I was going to say next. And then I'd be like, oh no, that could happen when I'm on stage. What will that be? What will that feel like if I forget what I'm going to say? That's going to be awful. And I would get into this state of major anxiety. And this went on for a week until literally got to the night before. And I thought, oh, I'm going to get no sleep here. I'm going to spend the whole night just rehashing what I'm going to say. This is like a 3-4 day event. So there's a lot of material. And I'm going to get, there's always going to come that point where I just don't know what to say next. What the hell am I going to do? And this is how that night unfolded, is that I went to bed, started, I said, I'm not going to rehearse. I'm going to try my best to not think about it. But needless to say, I started that whole process, started going over it in my head, going over my script, blah, 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 blah. And then I would have inevitably that moment, or those moments where I would forget what comes next. And this was now getting to the crunch. This is like, I'm going to have to get out on that stage tomorrow morning. And this is when it's going to happen. I'm going to forget what I'm going to say. And that I started to feel really panic stricken. And this went on until about 4 o'clock in the morning, by which point I was just so overwhelmed and so exhausted that I just didn't know what I was going to do next. And then it was really beautiful, because I had this sudden moment of clarity where after all this turmoil and all this anxiety, I suddenly asked myself the question, well, how would you coach yourself in this situation? What would you say to your situation? And then it very clearly to me that I would talk from my heart. I would speak from my heart. And the relief in that moment of having this understanding that that's the direction that I should go was just so profound. And at that very moment, so relaxing, that it just really allowed me to calm down. And I really settled into that experience. And I stayed there for probably about 20 minutes and felt great. And then after about 20 minutes, my ego and my intellect got back on board. And I'm like, there's this little voice saying, it's too late. You can't do that now. There's no way you're doing that now. You gotta go with all the material you've spent all these weeks working on. And so I went straight back into mental turmoil, straight back into the experience of like going through in my mind what I was going to say, how I was going to deliver it, and then have the experience of forgetting what comes next and having sheer panic. And then after literally about 30 minutes of this, I just suddenly recalled what it was like to have the experience where 30 minutes before I was going to talk from my heart, and how that felt so amazing and felt so relaxing. And so I said to myself, I just want to go back there. I'm just too exhausted. I feel beaten by this. I'm going to have to take this leap of faith, and I'm going to do this. I'm like, at this age, at this point in my life, if I crash and burn, if I walk out on that stage, I'll get over it. It may be awkward for some, there may be a few seconds of like wanting the stage to swallow me up, but at least I'll have had the courage to do it. And so I decided, I made this decision. I'm going to talk from my heart. I'm going to go on that stage, and I'm going to be spontaneous, and I'm going to throw the script away. And so, and what was so amazing about that is that the nerves just completely lifted. This big black cloud just disappeared, and I fell straight to sleep. I woke up in the morning. I had zero nerves. There was just like, and public speaking is one of my greatest fears. I was terrified of public speaking, particularly at that level. But all those nerves and anxiety dissipated into thin air. And I remember just walking out onto that stage and still, you know, sitting actually on the front row, waiting to be invited up on stage, no nerves. Walking up on that stage, no nerves. Picking up the mic, no nerves. And then talking from my heart and just telling the story as it had unfolded the night before. And I used that as my opening gambit. And I, you know, I want to say without blowing my trumpet too loud, is I feel like Rohini and I really knocked it out of the park. And I think that perhaps if we'd gone in the other direction, it would have been a whole different story. And what was so funny about it was that, you know, I think on the third day, you know, and by this point I was really comfortable. I was really feeling like this is actually really quite easy, and I'm really enjoying this. And we really didn't know how we were going to start that morning session. And Rohini said, well, you know, what are we going to talk about this morning? And I said, I don't know. Actually, maybe I should use some of the material that, you know, I've been working on and I've been writing. You know, I feel like I've spent all that time working on that material. Be a shame not to sort of like see it, you know, to see it in action. So I don't know what she thought about that, but that's kind of the direction that we went in. And you could have heard a pin drop in the room. There was like no reaction to it at all. Just like no one found it remotely funny. And it was just such a glorious eye-opener to me, just to see how, yeah, you know what, go with the heart, be spontaneous, because that works so much more effectively. And so that was yet another insight for me, another really with one of my greatest fears, which was public speaking. And then, you know, since then, I feel like I've really observed people who train and people who teach, and even with stand-up comedy, I noticed that the people that really talk from that space, the people that really look like they're authentically talking from their heart and are talking in the moment. I'm sure, you know, people prep, and I think there's no problem with prepping. But I think, as George says, is the great thing about prepping when you do a public when you do a presentation in public, is that you just let it go and trust in the intelligence and the wisdom to course through you in the moment. But I've since been observing, you know, trainings, and there's one particular experience I had where Rohini and I have done some prison work over the last few years. And there was one occasion, and these, you know, we go in with this group of volunteers, and I think there are about 100 volunteers and maybe 200 inmates. And through the course of this one weekend, there were some inmates who shared, and there are inmates who have shared in the past who usually get a hold of the mic and are so eloquent and so dynamic in the way that they speak. And I've always marveled at the things that they say. But what's so interesting about it is that, you know, if you looked at the transcripts of what it said, it would read really impressively. Anyway, so I had been talking to a couple of inmates who had mentioned that the people that generally got up and shared, and these people who were particularly eloquent, were great exponents of Toastmasters. That apparently Toastmasters, which is public speaking course, is very much a part of prison. You know, it's one of the things that you can do in prison, and it's very popular. And he said that all these people that shared, particularly on this weekend and share in general, these are like the stars of Toastmasters. So I thought, well, that explains a lot. But then what was so interesting, getting this information and then watching these guys get up and share, that interspersed with those guys and their sharing were these guys that got up and shared from the heart and shared their story and their truth. And what was so interesting when you compared the two is like everybody was kind of impressed with the Toastmaster guy's eloquence. But when the guys who got up and shared from the heart, there was not a dry eye in the house. Everybody was so impacted that, you know, the whole room just jumped up in rapturous applause. And yet what was so amazing is that if you read the transcripts of what they'd shared, it wouldn't look at all impressive. But the transcripts of the guys who, like, you know, had read and rehearsed and written and rehearsed and presented this dynamic speech looked very impressive. But in the moment, it was not making impact. And this really harks back to me about the value of what, you know, the Pranskys, George and Linda and Bob talking about the impact of grounding. If we talk from our grounding, if we talk from our heart, that intelligence guide us in the moment, then that's where we have real value. And so for me, this has just been this incredible journey that just gets richer and richer and richer. And I feel like, you know, that apprenticeship program has just been the that just keeps on giving. And I joked about this with Rahini the other day that, you know, that for me, George in that first session was kind of like, I don't know if you're familiar with the film, the film, The Matrix, where Morpheus is sitting with Neo at the very beginning and said, here is the blue and the red pill, and the blue pill represents the illusion, let's say, and the red pill represents the truth. You have to choose one of those pills. And so I had inadvertently chosen the red pill, and I imagine it was a slow dissolving pill because nothing really happened in the moment in my first weekend. But the slow release medicine really kicked in that first argument that I had with Rohini, which is kind of funny because there was all this talk about how your mind needs to be settled to get insight. But my mind was, you know, that was really an eye in the storm moment when I had this really powerful and profound insight. But it was kind of like this slow release pill. And so that in actual fact really happened quite recently, where I had my last weekend up in Lacona, and I had taken up a client who actually was a friend of mine, and it so happens that her big fear. So my big fears, my two greatest fears, in fact, where I've had two of my greatest insights, have been around heights and public speaking. But on this particular occasion, I bring my friend up to be my client, and she has this fear of heights that she wants to work on. And so Linda, in her brilliance and annoyance too, to me, says, right, so this lunchtime, I'm going to give you some homework. I want you to go and walk across this bridge, which is like, it spans across this great big, what to me was a chasm with water below it, and see how you fare, see how you deal with your thinking. And I'm like, gee, thanks, Linda, that's great. And so I remember getting to this bridge and my friend jumping out of the car, and she just like forging on ahead, walking on, seemingly completely unimpacted by, you know, her fear of heights. And I am meanwhile terrified, and I'm like, oh my God, here am I supposed to be the person, like, she's my client, I'm supposed to be the one that has some kind of understanding around the principles, and I'm literally terrified. And I remember walking across this bridge, and there's this little walkway, and there are these huge trucks like driving at speed to my right, and to my left is this like horrible chasm that feels like it's about a mile high above this water. And I literally had to walk closer to the side of the railing rather than the side where the trucks were going by. And I was literally almost shaking in my shoes. And so anyway, my friend got to the middle of the bridge. I eventually caught up with her. And then we decided to stop at this point. Well, she decided to stop at this point. I would have happily walked on. And then we were looking out, and I was forcing myself to look out. And then in the process of looking out, and I purposefully wasn't looking down, I was looking out as far as I could, I thought I saw some dolphins jump. And I said, look, there's some dolphins jumping, dolphins. And so, sorry, I just lost my mic for a second. Look, dolphins. And she couldn't see them. But what was so interesting, we started having a conversation about dolphins. And in the process of that conversation, I suddenly realized I completely forgot about my fear of my thinking about my fear of heights had just completely gone off the table. So that was kind of interesting. And we completed our walk. We went back for our afternoon session, and I told Linda about the experience. And my client seemingly had really had quite an insight around it. But for me, I still went away, and I still had this horrible fear around heights, and that, you know, that never went away. But I was always conscious of the fact that this is some area in my life where I can't see my thinking, or I can't seem to get a grip on it. And so talk about slow release pill. So here we are about a year later, and one of the typical things that tends to get me going, I could drive up a mountain or drive up a mountain where there's no railings, and I get terrified, and I want to literally, I'm one of those drivers who drives at like 10 miles per hour and hugs the cold shoulder as I can. And so we had one of these situations where we were back in Lacona actually early on this summer, and we had to drive up a mountain or drive over a bridge. That's another bridge that was super high. And I get this experience driving up a bridge that has, you know, like a very steep gradient. And so here I'm driving, and I think Rohini was asleep, and I think my daughter was asleep in the back of the car, and I just wanted to pull over and have her take over. But I thought, no, I'm going to have to do this. I'm going to have to soldier on and go over this bridge. And it was super high to me. And then as I was going up the bridge, it just suddenly occurred to me, well, I can feel that here's my lizard brain, like it's in full fight or flight. But then I just suddenly was able to observe the thinking that wanted to get on board and really feed that lizard and make me freak out. But I thought to myself, well, what would happen if I just don't get on that train? What would happen if I just don't engage with that thinking? And so I decided I'm gonna feel the fear. There's no way I can stop myself feeling this fear, but I don't have to get on board that thinking. I don't have to get on board that train. So that's what I did. And it was a miracle. The thinking just couldn't penetrate. It just couldn't get inside my head. And I got over that bridge. And so then after that, we then went back to the scene of the crime, went back to the bridge that Linda told us to walk across. And I was able to handle it beautifully. So that for me was just another one of those insight moments. And again, my apprenticeship program, The Gift That Keeps On Giving, that slow release pill, I imagine and I hope and want to believe that I've taken a few of those, and there will be more insights to come. So that I see is, I've gotten, my goodness, I've spoken for quite a long time, but I guess this would be the point where if there are any questions, I would gladly welcome them. And hopefully I'll provide a good answer. So Bonnie, I don't know, how does this unfold from here?
Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself. You can scroll down into the lower left-hand corner of the screen to unmute yourself, or you can raise your hand if you have the participant window up. Any takers? Any comments? It was very funny. I enjoyed this.
Well, you know, I think that what I've really enjoyed about doing this work is that I did see an angle through storytelling, and so sort of getting the initial advice and encouragement to sort of always rely on my grounding and speak from my heart has really served me well. And I think that every now and again, it seems like Rohini will throw me into this situation where I will do a training with her. And so one example I think is really funny, where she was going to do a corporate training, and she had invited me. I don't know what it is with small groups and me, but she had invited me to come along and lead a small group, but she was going to be the main facilitator, and that I was going to run a small group. So in my head, I'm just going to be at the back of the room, and you know, the small group, maybe I'll have a little bit of nerves around that, but I'm sure I'll handle it okay. At least I don't have to be at the front of the room. Anyway, the clients on this particular occasion got the wrong end of the stick and thought that I was a co-facilitator, and that's kind of how they saw me. So I ended up having to co-facilitate this event with Rohini. He had, you know, months of sort of experience with these people, and I had no experience with them whatsoever. And I'm like, oh my goodness, what on earth am I going to do? So, and I've always kind of felt like, well, I've got to have some story to tell. There needs to be something that I can use. And I had nothing that I felt that would be of value to the corporate world. But then right in the middle of it, and just, you know, just having that trust that hopefully something will kick in, somehow my wisdom, and I'll settle down and my wisdom will kick in. I literally, just the week before, I had this amazing experience where Rohini had come back from a job in London and been paid in cash, and had told me to look after it or keep it or put it in the bank or do something with it, but she'd given it to me. And so I had hidden it. And so I literally thought that I had hidden it. I don't think I've hidden it. I thought I'd put it on a desk in our bedroom. And so a few days later, Rohini said to me, "So did you put that cash in the bank?" And I said, "No, it's on the desk. It's on the top shelf of the desk." And we went into the bedroom to get it, and it wasn't there. And I was, oh my God, what's happened to the cash? Where is it? And I literally got so overwrought and strung out, and my mind went crazy trying to think where I'd hidden it, and I couldn't imagine what I'd done with it, to the point where I got so upset that I suddenly thought, well, oh God, we had workers in our garden yesterday. Maybe they stole it because they maybe saw it through the French windows and pinched it. And so I went marching over to the site manager, and I said, "Look, I think one of your workers has stolen some money from our house." And they're like, "Oh no, we better go and see the foreman." So I was I was just so sped up and strung out. And so then I came back, and I spoke to Rohini, and I said, there's no joy there. I think they must have stolen it. And I was still racking my brains. And then I remember going into the shower, getting under the shower head, and again saying to myself, "Look at you, all sped up and strung out. You're supposed to be a 3-principal coach. What the hell are you doing here? How would you coach yourself in this situation?" And I said to myself, well, first and foremost, you'd settle down. But in the process of engaging with that train of thought, I did actually settle down. And then when I realized, oh my goodness, I'm relaxed again, in that one split second, I remembered exactly where I'd hidden the money. And I'd hid it in a silver teapot on the shelf in the living room. And the reason I shared this story with these guys, with these corporate types, was that I gave this as an example about how we can get really sped up. And when we get really sped up, we can't come up with solutions. So if we're really anxiously trying to find an answer, and we're coming from that mindset, we're not going to get anywhere. We need to really learn to settle down. That's where the juice is. That's where we get insight. That's where we get solutions. So it was great because these guys who, for my money, kind of like all MIT maniacs, super smart and crazy intellectuals, they loved that story. So again, it was just for me a great validation of how storytelling and teaching the principles, stick with your grounding, stick with what you know, and speak from your heart, always seems to come up trumps. So I guess that's my number up. I hope my mic seems to keep going in and out. I hope that hasn't been a problem.
There were a few little blips. It wasn't too bad.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome. That was fun.
Wonderful hearing all your stories. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I saw a lot of smiling faces. So I think it was well received.
Oh, well, good. Well, thank you, Bonnie. Thank you so much for putting this together. And I love the fact that there's this opportunity to hear all the different teachers share their understanding. And I love the fact that you facilitate this. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah.
Just for everyone, I'll say again that I'll put Angus's website underneath the recording in case you want to get in touch with him. That the next webinar is on October 10th, and it's with Michael Neal. So
good one.
Yeah.
Well, thank you everybody for tuning in, and I'm really touched and honored that you were tuning in for me. So thank you so much.
Bye everyone.
Okay, take care. Have a great day. Bye.